Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bridging the Disability Gap podcast. I'm your host, Kasia Sarpala. First, I want to thank you all for tuning in and listening to this episode. The purpose of this podcast is to explore a term that I have developed over the last few months called the disability gap. It's a framework for understanding how individuals with disabilities are still systematically excluded from many different areas, such as housing, education, employment, healthcare, and other areas. To give you guys a quick rundown of how this podcast episode is structured, first we'll talk about the history of disability advocacy and how we got to where we are today. Then we'll talk about other frameworks that are similar to the disability gap developed by other scholars. And then we'll talk about the disability gap in the real world based on research and data I have collected over the last few months. And lastly, and most importantly, interviews with individuals in the disability community to amplify their voices and make the right moves for change. Disability activism really took off in the 60s and 70s when there was already a lot of civil rights movements happening. And luckily, we were able to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990. But remember, that started in the 60s. It took 30 years for the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, to be taken seriously. And even with these laws, as important as they are and crucial to the foundation of equal access, there's still a lot of ableist beliefs built into our system that restrict access for many people, even if the laws state X, Y, and Z for employment, healthcare, or education. There are still so many gaps that go unnoticed because unless you live as a disabled individual, you wouldn't understand. It's not about people lacking ability. It's about the systems that are designed without disabled people in mind. We've made progress, but the reality is there are still many barriers built into our systems. From an academic standpoint, there are two models that we can use to evaluate disability. The first is the medical model, which kind of views disability as something to be fixed, where the person is broken and not the system that we live in. The second model is the social model, which most disability activists are advocating for. This model states that a person is not the problem or their disability, but how society creates barriers which prevent people from being successful. So the medical model treats the disability, the social model values the person and accepts them for who they are, and doesn't view the disability as an illness or something to be fixed. When we shift our perspective, we see how policies, buildings, and technologies can either close or widen the disability gap. Kat Holmes calls this mismatch, which is a gap between how something is designed and the diversity of people who will use it. One concept I really want to highlight is one created by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's intersectionality. Now, some of you might be familiar with this term, some of you may not. So it's factors like race, gender, class, disability, all those areas overlap, which can create different layers of inequalities, often making things much worse. So maybe you're a disabled Black woman versus a disabled white man. Those two individuals are going to have very different experiences, even if they have the same disability. The National Disability Institute reports that people with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty, and that risk rises when disability intersects with race, gender, or other marginalized identities. Now, what does this disability gap look like in the real world? First, let's talk about education. According to the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, disabled students are more likely to be punished in school and less likely to be promoted to advanced classes, even if they're eligible for those classes. If you ask me, I think school is hard enough. Having a disability and having to deal with other students, teachers, not treating you as an equal is definitely a struggle. Now let's talk about employment. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2023, only 22.5% of disabled individuals had jobs versus 65% of non-disabled individuals. Yes, there are laws to protect disabled workers. We hear it all the time when you're applying for jobs, and they say they can't discriminate, but it's still happening. And while this is not directly related to employment, the systems that they have in place for disabled individuals to become more independent are very broken and lacking in structure and flexibility for individuals to become independent. So now let's talk about housing. Some homes and buildings meet accessibility rules. On paper, they do, but it doesn't mean they are easy to access or fully following the rules. Many disabled individuals still face discrimination when trying to rent or buy a home. The Urban Institute investigated this and found that enforcement of these housing laws falls very short. One example of this is a renter that needs an apartment, and their apartment entryway has a gap from the ground to the actual entry, and they need a ramp. A lot of the times, especially with private landlords, they won't accommodate. Another issue to consider is access to public buildings. A lot of the time, they have certain building codes they need to follow, and while some of it checks out great, they have ramps, they have elevators. But what about braille signs for people who are visually impaired, or quiet rooms for people who get overstimulated easily? People don't think about these things, and they're not enforced, unfortunately. So now, what about healthcare? According to Gloria Kahn, most disabled people get worse healthcare overall, and they are less likely to get regular checkups. They face physical barriers in clinics and may even receive biased opinions and attitudes from doctors. Now let's discuss technology. Technology is such a wonderful thing, and it can be used for people who are disabled. Kat Holmes wrote, "Design focus around default users often leads to assumptions. So when they design programs or technologies from the ground up, they're often designing it for people who they assume are able-bodied and don't need accommodations." Amy Hamray highlights that even things that are labeled to be universally designed actually fall short, and disabled people are not part of the design process from the beginning, so they don't get everybody's perspectives. I know we went over those areas really fast, and there is so much more research and data I could bring to the table to exemplify how ableist systems are still creating barriers for people who are disabled. There's only so much that can be explained with research and data. That's why I believe a big part of this podcast is hearing the voices from the disabled community themselves, because that's where the real truth lies. Let's hear from our first guest.
Hi, I'm Megan. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder that mainly affects my joints, but every other aspect of my body too.
Can you share a time when a system or space made you feel excluded?
Yeah, the time I'd like to share about in the school system. My disability really started to get bad when I was about 14, and I didn't receive my diagnosis until years after. And so all 4 years of high school, I was still undiagnosed. I faced a bunch of barriers because of that, because the teachers didn't understand why I was missing so much class. I remember talking with my AP European history teacher about how often I was gone, and she said, "Well, you at least have to come to school on the days you have my class." And I didn't know how to explain to this grown woman that I can't schedule my debilitating pain. It calls the shots all the time. And my PE teacher made me run the mile despite having a doctor's note. I was always the last one to finish. But after the third time, when I finally puked and was sobbing from the pain, he finally let me sit out and turn in a paper instead.
Did the school system do anything about that to make things better, or did they just leave it at that?
It was so complicated because they always talked in a way that seemed understanding, but it's like you said, it's easy to put in writing, but it's harder to put in practice unless you've lived it. And so they would say, oh, well, like, yeah, you have a 504 in place, so we can help with this. But any of the things that would actually accommodate my specific situation weren't really taken seriously. Like, my requests were too much, which they never were. So I didn't understand.
Just a bare minimum.
Exactly. It didn't feel like any of the staff had any training on like how to interact with students with disabilities unless it fit into the box of what they had set up already.
Right. That sounds like a very emotional experience.
Like, I was 14 and I was talking to these fully grown adults.
Pretty disappointing.
It was.
How do your other identities like race, gender, or income affect the way you experience your disability and access?
As a white woman, I haven't had any discrimination from my race, but considering the woman aspect, I have had barriers, especially in the healthcare field. And since I have an invisible illness and it's considered rare, the disbelief and misunderstanding are so common in nearly every space that I have to interact with.
Right.
Being low income doesn't help because, like, even when there are interventions available, a lot of them, even if they're covered by insurance or whatever, have copays that are simply, they make the entire procedure completely inaccessible.
Mm-hmm. In relation to your low income status, is that linked to your disability?
It's definitely linked. Since I'm on state income, I have a fixed amount that I get, and it does not leave any room for savings. And like, even when I talk to medical professionals where I'm like, oh, I can't afford this copay, they say, well, yeah, that's something you would have to save for. And it's like, you don't understand. I'm paycheck to paycheck. There's no room. I've had doctors who ask me questions that I know they wouldn't ask a man. And it has made the entire experience of feeling unseen by the medical industry even worse.
So a lot of it's gender-based, and because it's an invisible disability, it's even more discriminated against because especially male practitioners are assuming it's all in our head because we're female.
Doesn't help when you have an anxiety diagnosis either, because then they just love chalking it up to that.
Again, you got to sit into that box.
It's so frustrating when it's the medical system, because all the other systems I get, like, they don't have a lot of experience with people outside of a certain box, but the medical system is set up for that. And it feels like we're just completely excluded.
Have you ever had to come up with your own way of navigating inaccessible systems? Like, have you had to problem solve on your own, even if it wasn't already set up that way?
Unfortunately, yes, I did. And it was as a teenager. I remember, like, after years of trying to make in-person schooling work, my mom and I had to go to my guidance counselor in one of our frequent trips because I'd missed a lot of school at that point. But I was able to keep my grades up. But despite that, the absences were taking a toll on, like, my quality of learning, because half the material that was covered was through instruction. And so I had a few accommodations in place. Like, my mom was able to pick up schoolwork and all that. But since I was missing so much class, I had tried to talk with him about, like, maybe if I could Skype into, like, with my friends, because I had at least one friend in every class. This was before Zoom. And I just remember him telling me that that's not a feasible option. He didn't give any alternatives or any explanation as to, like, why it wouldn't work. He just said, that's not a feasible option. And this was my guidance counselor. It's kind of his job to help me figure it out. I eventually conceded, and I was like, okay, well, what about online schooling? Because I needed extra support. And he told me, I'm fairly certain those options are reserved for terminally ill children. I was so dumbfounded because I'm 15 at this point, talking to a full-grown man whose job it is to help me.
And they just let you down.
It felt like I was let down at every turn.
Like you weren't disabled enough to meet the necessary requirements to receive accommodation.
I often felt not disabled enough.
If you could redesign any system to be more inclusive, whether it's school, work, tech, or something else, what's one change that you would make?
If I had to choose just one system, regardless of my struggles with the school system, I'd choose the medical field. Because the school system has an endpoint, and I'm stuck with the medical field for the rest of my life.
That's understandable.
Unfortunately, the medical field has caused me more trauma than every other inaccessibility I've faced. And the betrayal of having to watch half my doctors Google my condition in front of me just to treat me like a secondary source to my own lived experience. It's so demoralizing.
What specifically about the medical system would you change?
Choosing one is hard, especially because I don't feel like any one change will make a big enough impact, but one change at a time, I suppose. I think the thing that I would suggest is continued education, because doctors have to take courses every once in a while, but they're allowed to choose which courses they take. And I think that it really limits the way that they can experience people with lesser known disabilities. Because most of the doctors that I've encountered, if they know about my condition, they know the 3 bullet points that they saw on a slideshow 8 years ago. And then they act like the things that I'm requesting are ridiculous requests, despite me having done a ton of medical research on my own. Because if the doctors don't know what's going on, I have to. The only reason that I got a diagnosis to begin with was because I brought it to my doctors. Because after years of saying, this isn't just growing pains, it seemed like the only way they would listen was from another medical professional saying that this is a problem. And so I brought research and I was like, please at least test me. And the only reason I got the diagnosis was because the doctor that did it, his ego was larger than his list of credentials.
And they don't want to be held accountable if they don't follow up and then something is life-threatening and they say, oh, you don't need to be diagnosed.
I think that doctors specifically, they don't really get the level of validation that comes with a diagnosis. I spent years thinking that I was exaggerating, that I was just worse at living than everyone else. And so to have a diagnosis to say this is a real thing that is actually causing issues meant that I wasn't crazy this whole time.
And that carries over so many levels of emotional and mental trauma.
Yeah, unfortunately, it hasn't stopped. I've gotten a little bit better at navigating it, but the way that the medical gaslighting works, it's never something straightforward. It's never something enough to report the doctor for. It's always the eye rolls and scoffs and, well, that's not really how we do this thing that makes you feel crazy after a while.
You said it perfectly, medical gaslighting. Would you like to share anything else in relation to your disability or your thoughts on how our society views it?
What I'd like to share is mainly about society, like the ugly laws, the group of laws that were basically built to punish disabled people for being disabled and living. The last one was used in 1974. But the Nazis, they started with the disabled community. Those they deemed unworthy of life were always the most vulnerable in any given situation, seen as expendable, or the world's largest minority group. 1 in every 10 people living with a disability and still treated like we're a nuisance, something to be tolerated instead of respected. To this day, we're infantilized and seen as a strain on the system instead of people with no choice who need help and compassion.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your experiences.
I really appreciate being able to be a part of it.
Now let's hear from our next guest, Tracy. Can you describe a time when you felt discriminated against because of your disability?
Quite a few years ago, I went to look at a house and I was able to talk to the real estate company, but their exact words were they didn't think I could make it up and down the stairs because I had lost my leg back in 2011, so I was in a wheelchair. And I did try and explain to them that I had no problem going up and down stairs, but they refused to rent to us because of that situation. I even volunteered to build a ramp and they just refused to and decided to rent to somebody else. At one point, I'd been working for Walmart for quite a while, and I think I'd been there for about 3.5 years. A position had come open for team lead, and I had applied for it. It was the first time they actually ever gave me an interview, because any other time I applied for management, they would never interview me. So when they did this one, they said, hey, everything looks good. You qualify for all this. We got a couple more to do, and we'll let you know. So when they did let me know, they said, well, we decided to go with somebody that has more experience in retail and apologize and everything else. So one day when I was working, I had met the new girl that had gotten the position I went for, and she kept asking for help because she didn't know how to do all these different things. So when I was talking to her after I'd helped her with different tasks, I asked her, how long have you been working in retail? Her exact words were, I've never worked a day of retail in my life. And I asked her, where'd you work before Walmart? She goes, I never worked for another store. She goes, I was ex-military. And I go, okay. So when I confronted the management, they just denied it all. So they just told me that somebody that had more retail experience, but they never had no experience at all.
That's really frustrating.
It is.
Have you ever had an experience where your race, class, or gender influenced your experience as a disabled person?
I don't think my race, my gender, none of that. I've never experienced any discrimination for any of that, for being disabled with any of that. I felt discriminated because I'm in a wheelchair with one leg, and that was my basis for the counts of discrimination I felt.
That makes sense. Have you ever had to find a solution to a problem related to your disability that should have been integrated from the beginning?
There's multiple places. Oh my gosh. When you go to a little corner store or different businesses that don't have that ramp or way for somebody in a wheelchair to get up, I've had to get out of my wheelchair, hop up steps while dragging my chair behind me to try and get up there and pray that I don't fall. It should be common. Every business should have it.
What about if you have to set up something at work because maybe there was a gap in accessibility somewhere at work and they were like, well, we don't really have a system in place to accommodate you and you've just had to figure it out?
The good thing about the job I'm in now, bunch of awesome people. I've never had any problem. They know my disability. They work with me. I know if I needed something like I do right now where I can't wear a prosthetic because of an injury, I asked them, will you work with me to let me use my power chair in the office? When I have to drive to go post all these bogs, will you allow me to load it up onto my vehicle and go post the bog? And they were all for it. This is the type of employer that supports what you need to do to continue working with them.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. If you could change any system to be accessible for wheelchair users, what would you change?
Every business should be regulated to have a wheelchair access. That's one law I would change to make sure that it doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair, you should always have ADA access. If you fail to comply, then yes, you should be fined for it.
That segues well into the last question. Is there any other information you would like to add about how society views disabled people or the systems that we live with every day?
When I first lost my leg, I'm going to be honest, I was scared. I was honestly scared of how people were going to look at me because of me being in a wheelchair and with one leg. And I was no more than, I think, a week out of the hospital. And I wheeled myself up next to my truck. And this is California. Somebody walked right up to me and asked me, hey, can I help you with that? And that changed my outlook on things when it comes to being scared of how people are going to feel. And I think that there's more people out there willing to help and assist somebody that's disabled than people think.
Thank you for contributing your experiences and your thoughts on this topic.
You're very welcome.
Now let's hear from our final guest.
My name's Abby, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I am totally blind, 31 years old. I am community organizer, and I advocate for better transit throughout the region. I'm planning to go back to school to get my master's degree in this coming fall, and I will be getting a transportation planning degree. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Can you share a time when a system or space made you feel excluded because of your disability?
Yes, of course. I will definitely go with, I could share work or school, anything, but definitely will go with the school. Especially school is coming up for me. And yeah, I had my community college associate degree and I have bachelor's degree, but both colleges, there's a lot of struggles. As a blind person, I have to navigate inaccessible materials that, of course, not intentional from no one, but system set up in the beginning and everything's not planned for everyone in the mind. Sometimes materials are not accessible. I have to work around it, or sometimes I have to wait until my accessible document get to me to read assignments, and sometimes there's handouts in the classrooms are not accessible for blind people. I'm completely excluded because I do catch up after class, but I feel like during the class, everybody turned in their assignment, but because of inaccessible materials and things, I have to do mine after class, and it takes more of my busy time. Sometimes professors have to put students in a group to work together, different assignments and projects. As a blind person, I experienced that a lot of students don't understand how to work with blind person. Always a stressful situation, how I can teach them to work with me or show them I can do it. Always fighting to make it work, to be accepted by your classmates and do your class assignment, homeworks, project stuff, which takes 3 times longer than my sighted peers. I'm sure any of these people not intentionally wanted to exclude me, but the system, how it's set up and how it planned for the people who can access visually, but not people who are blind or low vision.
I can relate to that 100%. How do your other identities like race, gender, or income shape the way you experience disability and access?
Being disabled is one thing, but being Black person and also being woman have a lot of disadvantage. I don't know if I can explain enough how difficult it is to navigate the world as a Black disabled woman. I know you can actually even imagine what it's gonna be like because of my skin color, even navigating my own group in the disability community too. It's a little different. That shapes my accessibility and disability a little differently than if I could be white woman or man. I appreciate you for this opportunity because a lot of times people don't think about your disability plus different things like your race, which I am Black and being woman adds up and world becomes harder and harder, unfortunately.
Have you ever had to come up with your own way to navigate an inaccessible system? Even if it wasn't integrated into it from the beginning, you've just had to figure it out on your own.
So last year, I purchased house and built last year too. There's no reason brand new house shouldn't be accessible for people who are wheelchair users. When I buy, I have to buy, I need a house. But I bought a house and I realized I have a lot of people who use a wheelchair and a lot of friends. I want to invite them to my house. I mean, I feel like there's no excuse for new house not being accessible for wheelchair. But how I come up with my own way to make it accessible was I have to order a portable wheelchair ramp and put that so my friends who are wheelchair users coming to my house can access to get into house, which home builder should make sure that is accessible for the people with disability.
That's understandable. Have you experienced anything related to your vision that you've had to accommodate for yourself?
Oh my goodness, that is every day. And I don't even think about that because that become norm. That is everyday access problem. Unless I'm doing my own presentation, it's always gonna have problem because even when events or a community event or a school presentation and a screen, of course, it's really harder for me to retain entire information there because I can't see either image or PowerPoints. So what I do is I get that PowerPoint and I have to figure out to make it make sense to me by putting it in an accessible document unless they do it for me. But a lot of times, even if they trying to make it accessible, it's possible it might not be completely 100% accessible. So I have to make it work. I mentioned earlier about my classes and I have to work after class at my extra time to do stuff to make everything my assignments get turned in or things like that. This all me accommodating for myself, making this work transportation wise. A lot of times people who can see can find a way to cross busy streets with light that doesn't make sound like no audible signal. If there's no audible signal, I have to walk way far away to find the audible signal to cross safely. That means I have to make it accessible by going out of my way to cross safely that other people don't have to deal with.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If you could redesign one system to be more accessible, whether it's school, work, tech, or anything else, what's one thing that you would change?
If I were to choose one, sadly, one is not enough, but I will make one system software that makes everybody like a blind, low vision, sighted people all gonna just access and works. I don't have to go through hoops to make my materials accessible. If they can create this thing, they can create it all once accessible. It could be all, I don't have to deal with image not gonna be described or PDF document not gonna be open or this software not gonna work for me. I have to figure out a different way to access this document, assignment or something. There's so many different software systems that is not created for me as a blind person. I have to do it differently. If I have a way to fix one thing to make it universal, everybody can just access it. That's what I want to make it accessible. Other area, as I mentioned, like walking far away to find accessible crosswalks. But even when you are walking, some places like no sidewalks, or there's a sidewalks, but sidewalks not completely accessible. There's overgrown bushes or cracked sidewalk that could trip me. I could trip and fall or something like that. So I want to make it sidewalk completely accessible for people who use a wheelchair, people who use a cane, easily navigate without worrying about getting hit by cars.
Would you like to share anything else about yourself or thoughts on how our society views disability?
Unfortunately, we have to educate people every day. People with disability can be anything. We can be anything we want to be. But I want to speak only about my personal experience. There's times people don't want to speak to me. Like, it's just interesting. But even if you go to doctor's appointment with sighted person, they will ask sighted person about my problem because they don't think I can answer. So like, society seeing people with disability, we don't understand, or we can't do things, or we can't take in charge of our own life or communicate with them. Or not only doctor, that's just one example, but everywhere. Like, you go to restaurant, or you go to events, or you could go to, like I said, we can be anything we want to be, but how society sees us is different. We have to educate them constantly. I feel like I'm educating people every day about my disability. And if I have to do it every day, so people are not learning or trying to learn that we are exactly same people. Everybody's the same. We all function the same way.
I appreciate you contributing your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much, Abby. Huge thank you to all of our guests that were willing to share their stories with us today. I hope you all learned something new and enjoyed learning about the disability gap. Hopefully someday access will be the default and not the exception. Wait, don't go yet. During the production and processing of this podcast, when I went to publish, it was extremely difficult to integrate captions and transcripts for the publishing process for various podcast hosting platforms, which is extremely frustrating, but it further exemplifies the disability gap. I really hope platforms start taking this kind of thing seriously because access matters. My name's Keisha Sarpala, and if you would like to connect with me, please follow the links in the description. Thanks.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.